Hello, and welcome to SecureTalk, a podcast where we explore the critical world of information security innovation and compliance. I'm your host, Justin Beals, founder and CEO of StrikeGraph. Together with our expert guests, we'll provide you tools and tips to help your business thrive in the rapidly evolving cybersecurity environment. Welcome to SecureTalk, everyone. We have another exciting guest to chat with today. I'm really glad to introduce Dr. Aaron Mauro. He is an associate professor of digital media at Brock University in Ontario, Canada. He teaches in both interactive arts and science and the PhD in interdisciplinary humanities programs on topics relating to digital culture, natural language processing, and app development. One of the reasons we're getting to chat with Aaron today is that he is now the author of two books that study the cultural consequences of cybersecurity. One is Hacking the Humanities, and he has a work that's coming out very soon called The Language of Cyberattacks. Aaron, thank you for joining SecureTalk today. We're really glad to chat with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Justin. I'm really happy to be here.
Excellent. Well, as a part of that introduction, I really enjoyed reading the books because, as many listeners will know, because it's a story we've told before, my academic career ended at my theater degree. But obviously, I work in technology, sometimes as a chief technology officer or an architect, a developer, a security engineer, and lately as an entrepreneur or founder. And I think a lot of our listeners may not understand fully what even the humanities are or how they impact us. So I was hoping you might help us introduce this field of study as an expert. And maybe what I should start with is maybe you can tell us a little bit about your origin story. How did you start to cross-connect cybersecurity and the humanities?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And I think a lot of people who are working in security or kind of are working or observing the security industry are really coming at it from a different range of backgrounds. And so we kind of all have these stories. But for me, I have to go back to kind of the mid-90s, the turn of the millennium. I'm an elder millennial, so Y2K was happening just as I was graduating high school, and I kind of came into this world of fear and paranoia online. The dot-com bubble burst, just kind of adding to this sense of cynicism and kind of gloom. And in the midst of all of that, as I'm growing up as a, punk kid on the Canadian prairies, I really loved cyberpunk. That kind of hacker mystique, as kind of cringy as it is, was a space of a lot of imagination for me that I was able to escape into. And, like William Gibson's The Sprawl trilogy and Neuromancer in particular, just kind of matched with a lot of the feelings at the time around the early web. There was just kind of this quality of wanting to inhabit this place. It was so exciting, and wanting to really kind of build websites. This was like the early days. You might, like Angel Fire in like the 90s and like MySpace and IRC and stuff. So, and I don't think I'm unique in all that. Like there's a whole generation of us who really come into cybersecurity thinking about, the ways that it touches on how we interact with digital culture and the ways that we're thinking about this. And so we now in the 21st century, we live our lives 24/7 online, for better or for worse. But there was this kind of heady golden day with, Napster and peer-to-peer sharing and getting access to all of this new cultural content. And as time has gone on, we've seen how, like ebooks and games and movies and just DRM in general and on streaming platforms is really shaping the way that we access this stuff. And so, I think about the kind of the hacker idea, right, as this kind of romantic thing, going back to Angelina Jolie. And, even I was watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer with my kid over the pandemic and how much hacking was really a part of it. So there's that kind of idealism and like the neon fun of the 90s kind of culture of surfing around the web. But so much of it was about building. Right? Like we were building websites and we were, on MySpace and tweaking it and hacking it. That was kind of the flex for the time. But, as we grew, there was this period around like 9/11, quickly, like 2001, that some of that really shifted. It was a time when, the economic downturns, around the dot-com, but 2008. And I kind of moved into the university and really never left. But my work around studying the visual culture of security started with 9/11 and that kind of move where we're thinking about, security theater, the ways that it shaped how we interact and the kind of cultural conversations around it, as well as the visual culture around it. And so that was something that I kind of came into. I wrote a pretty substantial summary article around that time, around 2011, in fact, around the 10-year anniversary. And so that was kind of me coming into thinking about security and thinking about culture and as they came together. But when I came into this discipline called digital humanities, it felt very, very similar to that 90s feeling of making the web, right? We were building things. It was about studying culture and making applications and websites and things. And this became, my work as an educator, as a researcher. And a lot of the work that needed to be done was building new curriculum for humanities students in universities. And I did that at Penn State to start my career in the US. And I built a program that had a lot to do with app development. We were building things all the time. And so we were following the trajectory of Python and working with Flask and Django. And so as an educator then, I took my kind of early interest in hacker culture and the web and that kind of thing and really put it into the curriculum. And I found myself teaching not just app development practices, but security practices as first principles. So we were talking about data encryption and password management, sanitizing inputs, managing web app endpoints, cross-site scripting, right? And so the OWASP Top 10 kind of became like a teaching resource for me. And, after that, teaching undergraduates how to build applications and do it securely, I just really started to follow the cybersecurity industry. And I realized with a lot of these authors that they were making arguments and claims about how we act online and what digital culture looks like. So some of the authors that I really valorize, like, Kim Zetter and Catalin Campanu and Dan Gooden, Sean Lingas, Andy Greenberg, these folks are not really seen in academic circles, but are really making some of the most consequential arguments and claims about what life is like online these days. And so the work of the book is really about kind of meshing that world and that conversation with some of these academic authors like, Alexander Galloway and Eugene Thacker in 2007 wrote a book called The Exploit, which was one of the early ones that really started to think about hacker culture. Mackenzie Wark in Australia now, her important book, The Hacker Manifesto. These were really pivotal moments for a lot of us. And then you have, Pekka Himinen, The Hacker Ethic, and Gabrielle Coleman, The Hacker Hoaper Whistleblower Spy, which was the great book on Anonymous from 2014. Those kinds of works coming together just felt like a really wide field that needed to be kind of drawn together. And it really came into that phrase they used in the introduction around, what is the cultural consequences of cybersecurity? Because I think this industry is having increasingly important impacts on, the ways that we behave and the kind of lives we live online.
Yeah. So amazing. I always really enjoy the cross connect, how we can conjoin different subject areas to create new information about what's valuable or a perception about what's going on in there. And there's certainly a lot of things that resonate to me about this. One is the building of the thing. We've had a discussion internally and I think externally as well, as we think about engineers. There was a time we were rapidly trying to get new software engineers. And we had a lot of boot camps and interesting educational tools kind of pop up. But one of the things I kept noticing is that we'd get people that were excited about a job, but they didn't have that passion to build something. It's interesting. I don't need the deepest amount of technical expertise, but what I really need is someone that loves to build, because they will go pull the manual out and figure it out. And that, I think, was the original, to me, part of that hacker ethos of, if I want to play this computer game, I've got to copy the code out of the magazine to play it. There's no other way to get it into the computer.
Yeah, and for me as an educator, there's an interesting kind of relationship, right? There's kind of an old phrase, you don't learn to hack, you hack to learn. And so building and making an application is just this inherent problem solving exercise where, you don't know how to make something from beginning to end, but you figure it out along the way. And really, it's about the application of a broader sensibility that, I'm trying to articulate as something around a broader sense of digital literacy. And hopefully that literacy carries with it a pretty strong sense of security and what it is to kind of behave online in a way that not only protects yourself, but is kind of generous and is a way that follows that kind of golden age of the web where we like to share online. And I think, like open source is one of those kinds of, I guess, ethoses that kind of resonates beyond software and really has a lot to do with the way that we share culture too.
Yeah. We have a lot of listeners that are maybe coming more from an engineering background, more from a technical background in working around security. I'd love if you could just help us express, what are the humanities, or even, how should security experts think about the humanities as impacting the human condition or their work?
Yeah, this is, it's a huge question and it's an interesting one, like, your own background with the humanities training. And I happen to know that there are more than a few graduates from humanities programs working in security. It's something that I think, your listeners will identify with. But, the humanities they sound stuffy and they're often defined by university departments, right? Like we have literature and theater and film, philosophy, history, dance, games now. But it's, I tell my students that it's all the stuff that makes life worth living. it's the good stuff. It's the stories that we tell and the things that we hold on to and the things that we want to share. But the discipline that I'm a part of, this digital humanities, right? We have this kind of additional tag that goes along with it. It really seeks to solve problems for those who want to study culture, right? And they want to use computational methods to help solve some of those problems. And what are problems that humanities people face? It has a lot to do with the transition to the web, that we have a generations long project to digitize the human cultural legacy. And it sounds grand, but this work is happening in places like galleries and libraries and archives and museums, as well as in universities. And it's really made possible by the very fact of the web. The fact that it exists means that now we have to make things available, not just so that they're preserved for the long term, but that increasingly, if it's not available online, it almost is like it doesn't exist, that they can be trapped in the analog. And so for a lot of the work that we're doing is we're invested in making things available in what we, think of as a kind of a cognate or related movement to open source. And we think of this as open access. And so the digital humanities is very much invested in open access and making things available to people, as well as studying now digital culture as it happens, because not just the old things, the things that are trapped in books and museums and archives, but that a lot of the work that we do is to study, the apps and the games and the social media, the data that's generated just by people inhabiting these digital spaces, as well as the software that's being generated. So there's a whole subdiscipline of critical code studies where we're reading things and understanding source code, which is becoming more and more important, especially with the proliferation of, we have to say it, artificial intelligence now. And really understanding these things is part of that kind of opening up of literacy for us. And it's a big problem, right? Like we have a lot of issues with just being online, not least of which are kind of trust or the erosion of trust and misinformation. And that the humanities is kind of predicated on really a good faith argument, the ability to exchange ideas, and misinformation really kind of blows that process up. And so for us in the humanities, we really do want to kind of help foster a space where meaningful cultural exchange can happen. And, there's a few kind of humanistic perspectives here that I might, just want to share. Here's, like maybe a few, but, that security culture, the ideas around what it is to make, a well-authenticated, well-secured space is an expression of values, right? Like what
Yes.
and who we protect assigns a kind of value to it. And those that we leave outside that circle of protection are inherently kind of, left out. And so that's a big question for us. There issues around the cultural context of attacks and things like that as we're studying some of these big events. Like we've had a couple with, CrowdStrike and, Snowflake and things like that, that the attribution of these attacks are increasingly, situated within a cultural context, a kind of a history of political ideology that drives attackers. And I think that the humanities has a lot to add to that as well. And so there's thinking around this that I think, we might be able to, as we build this crosswalk between disciplines, between security as an industry, as a way of thinking, and the humanities as this long running project, that might help to augment and shape the way that we do this work and maybe bring some more people on board.
So thinking of the security world in general and its engagement around the humanities, and I think we can cast a long net when we think about open source movements, freedom of information, early hacker culture. You have a statement in your book. I'd love to read it. It says, social and cultural change will emerge from communities best able to develop, deploy, and operate systems securely, without corporate dependencies or direct government control. This really resonated with me because it seems the apotheosis of our current state of the internet, which does feel 90% corporate controlled, 10 to 15% government control. And I think we're reaching to the government to try and change things. But you put forward the idea that neither of those entities are really going to give us the opportunity for change that we as a community might need to go through. What are your thoughts, about this breakdown in our relationship between corporations and government as a community, and how do you think those relationships should change so we can be positive about the future together?
Yeah, and again, it's a difficult kind of space to enter into, right? Between kind of governments and corporations, this is the way that we access things. And I like to go back to really foundational language, and thinking about agency and what does that look like online, and how do people retain autonomy online, and ultimately, if we are in fact digital citizens, how do we kind of express and use our freedom online and in a global network? And I don't think that there's anything simple about any of this, but I do think that we have to be really pushing for a broad-based digital literacy so that folks can take up that agency. And, I say this, maybe there's like kind of a two-part answer here for where we might be able to fit, this space between, government regulation and kind of corporate control. But I can tell you that young people in my classrooms, especially as they enter university, they are in a different world than those of us who were born in the 1900s, as they say, which really hurts me on a foundational level. I was like, ooh. But I think that some of us who can dip back into a kind of pre-web world and remember what that was like would be surprised to learn that, students these days, people in their 20s who are children of the 21st century, really don't know where their files are stored on their computer. They don't really know that there's things that are stored in directories that are encoded, and really that an OS is just a bunch of text files. And that there's something kind of intuitive about understanding the layers of abstraction in a computer that I worry is increasingly lost in these seamless UIs, productivity features, cloud storage, where everything is searchable. And that students, young people that I face might not be fully aware of what their systems are doing and how much metadata, or what Microsoft likes to euphemistically call telemetry, is collected, and that awareness, as it disappears, is part of where we lose a grip on that sense of autonomy and agency online. And, like developers will think about this, and when they're working perhaps in open source, and they'll be pulling in something from a supply chain, and they'll be thinking about their dependencies. And that is another real risk, where, we're thinking about these very large ecosystems. And even in that case, somebody who is quite literate and quite capable in building things might not be able to fully grasp where all of those tendrils lie. So we're all kind of victims of the increasing complexity, and the way that a lot of that complexity can kind of vanish before us. But I do think that there's something really fundamental to that kind of three ideas around agency and autonomy and freedom, that they're not merely something that we want to kind of talk about or hold on to, but that they can have real consequences. A story that I talk about in the book goes back to the events of January 6th in 2021, where, a few thousand supporters of then President Trump, decided to protest and start a riot on Capitol Hill. And we know the consequences of all of that. And, there's some 400 criminal cases that were taken up afterwards. But those cases were made possible by a hack. It was called Parlor Tricks, and I'm sure it's still on GitHub. I know I've cloned it. But that Parlor Tricks was a hack that was made over just a few days afterwards, somewhere in January 9th, after the riot on the Capitol, where, a hacker in their 20s by the name of Donk Enby on Twitter was able to download about 30 terabytes of incriminating data from Parlor. And this was in violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, surely, right? This is a hack that really was not technical in nature. It was basically just accessing an unrestricted API endpoint that the Parlor devs just left open. And so, it was a moment where we exposed a lot of the bad behavior in some of these platforms, where, we see that the content on Parlor was not cleaned, right? It retained all the GPS data. They were serialized in order, and they had dates associated. So all of that information was available. And when that 30 terabytes was dumped, it became quite a moment. It became a moment where we had, citizens building mapped visualizations of the riot. One of the ones that I really liked was Faces of the Riot. But if you wanted to go and look at it, what Parlor saw was really one of the big ones. And it gave this view of this event that wasn't quite captured elsewhere. And it became the stuff of the criminal cases that followed afterwards. And it was made possible by someone who is still anonymous, a single actor, though working in coordination with a group called Archive Team, who develops a downloading archiving tool called Warrior, which allowed for volunteers around that January 9th period to get enough bandwidth to download 30 terabytes from the systems. And then you have, groups like Distributed Denial of Secrets, who are hosting and sharing that data for the long term. So archiving it and holding it so that we can actually go back and look. And so that is the kind of freedom that I'm talking about, where regular citizens can access and look at information. There's really no breaking and entering. It's a matter of simply just knowing how to download. And, in this case, it was a bunch of Python scripts, but it's the kind of action that allows for historical moments like this to be better understood. And so as a humanist, as somebody who wants to have, the historical record retained as clearly as possible, it's pretty valuable to me. So there's a kind of solidarity with these kinds of people who take it upon themselves to, maybe do something that's quasi-legal, but, it's also something that I'm glad we have.
it was one of my favorite stories in the book. Actually, I had not known how much of that data was pulled from Parlor. So I, I really enjoyed reading it and how much data was pulled, what type of community was required to make that information useful. And I do think that that resonates with what I might like to see in a relationship with corporations that store my data and government, as well, is that we want that transparency to be able to create a clearer understanding as a community of what we like and don't like about certain activities. Well, one of my frustrations lately, Aaron, has been, I think, to your point of access, for example, and data that we store. You and I both built file systems. We stored data on it. We knew where to go look for that. Unless the cassette tape sat too close to a magnet, I was pretty much going to be able to get the data back off and onto my old Tatty RAM. But so much data is stored algorithmically now, right? Like, one of the things I could see for new digital citizens is that they don't think about where they store that thing because they believe that the algorithm will provide it for them when it's useful. It's no longer a part of their universe. Someone else owns it at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think again, it's a question of I suppose bringing people back to this history that is increasingly lost in the kind of seamlessness of what these UIs do, right? That I'm reminded of that Apple ad where, I'm not sure, the young person was sitting in front of their tablet and they ask, innocently, like, what's a computer? Because all they know is this, big screen with the soft user interface. And I think that moment is one to be mourned. And I think that we have to resist that. The moments where, young people get curious, though, and I think that they are, at least in my classrooms, that's where they want to be. They want to be building things and, really learning how things get made. That moment of curiosity is the one that I think that we should be, really baking into our earliest curriculum in grade school all the way up, so that we don't have things hidden behind this kind of slick UI, that it's about understanding how things are really put together. And I think from that onwards, that really growing sense of curiosity will be, I think, what will save us in the end. It sounds like Humanities to me, right?
Right.
being a curious person.
Well, we say hammer's looking for nails in our product work sometimes. So I'm going to make a little bit of a bombastic statement here, but there was a portion of your book that really resonated with me. So, in your book, you described kind of the anarcho roots of the punk movement. And I remember my first copy of the Sex Pistols' first album. I played it all the time at the skate park. But you kind of highlight that a lot of artists in the genre felt that punk was dead the second an album like that got released into mainstream culture in a way. And here's my bombastic statement, Aaron. Do we need to kill the internet, or has it already died as you and I understood it in 1999?
Oh, I wish we could just turn it off sometimes. That's for sure. Take a break. It's an interesting thing. Like I don't want to be too much of, the nostalgic kind of person looking back and valorizing dad rock as if it was, better than what's going on now, because it's not, right? And I think the past is not better, but we live in a global village, right? I'm thinking of, Marshall McLuhan, the great Canadian kind of media theorist from the 60s. That global village has really happened. It's a real thing. And it's brought us back to some of our more kind of base instincts. And this is what he predicted. And it's good in the sense that it really is an opening up all of that kind of nostalgia that we have for the early golden age of the web. But it has also, and McLuhan predicted this, it's exposed kind of opposing viewpoints across the globe. And so we have this extremism as a natural feature of simply being more connected. And I think that is something that is, punk, for what better or worse, is not really a valid term, but I also know punk when I see it. So maybe it's a valid adjective. But I was using that also to kind of describe, the I guess the cyberpunk genre that really is all around us. It's increasingly popular. I talked about, Buffy the Vampire Slayer and things like that. But, like I'm sure people are listening, it's like Devs, The Expanse, Mr. Robot, Altered Carbon, Westworld. Like, these television shows are incredibly popular because they are a moment to meditate on the experience of technology. And I think that that's what, cyberpunk does best as a genre. It's this kind of antagonistic force where we are thinking about what technology does in relationship to some kind of human experience. It's that experience of humanity in the midst of technology. And so in some ways it's humanity and technology that are the countercultures that describe cyberpunk. And so we have a few things that come out of that genre that I think fit in with the musical side of things too, right? Like a criticism of runaway corporate influence, ecological degradation, mass urbanization, cybernetics, and global communications. And in the midst of all of that, the genre cyberpunk is able to still tell something deeply human. And I think that those are those moments that I want to get to when we're looking at something that is science fiction, that's speculative, that is something that can give us, a window into our current experience. And, sitting in Canada in the beautiful Niagara region, I come back to McLuhan, who was really informative on a lot of this. And if we think about, his kind of model phrase, right? The medium is the message. The message of the internet is really about connection and sharing. But it's that sense of connection and sharing that also makes us vulnerable to malicious messages. And so maybe rather than kill the internet, to come back to your original questions, we need to remind folks that the internet is not just one application layer, right? There are many features that we can run on this network, and HTTP is just one of them. And so, I really like the Solid project that's been really advocated and touted by Sir Tim Berners-Lee. And I think that that's a real step forward for securing data and digital identities on the web. We haven't really seen that find a footing yet with a major application, but I think that's a nice one. And in the book, I spent some time talking about IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, which is a really interesting project conceptually as an alternate application layer for the web. And so, this is something that solves the problem of latency by moving the web really to the edge of the network as a peer-to-peer file sharing scheme. And so the idea is that if you're on another planet, say the moon or Mars, you could send files to that location and then share them locally. And so this is a different style of internet that has some real benefits in that it can not only solve that latency question if we move into the stars, but it also has this ability to kind of jump over, firewalls or sensor, issues if you're moving into different countries. And so this is an interesting model for an alternative internet, a different application layer for the internet that is a different way of thinking about how we share data, and really is a way of kind of moving away from and making strange some of the assumptions that we have with this kind of centralized network where we assume that we're hitting a server and bringing back data, which I think doesn't always serve the users in the best possible way.
Yeah. I'm struck by a couple things. One is you talk a lot about stories and cyberpunk stories in your book. And one of the things that struck me is when I read them a while ago, or was really the genre was just coming into play, I thought, oh, this is all quite futuristic. It's, very rarely are we right about the future, but yet so much of it has turned out to be the things we built or the way we expected them or the issues that we're seeing in those challenges. And you talk a lot about story authoring. And here, I think when you talk about the interplanetary file system, we're telling a future story as well through code, in a way, through a network architecture, through an aspiration that we want to see as humanity, and that information is available as humanity continues to spread out.
Yeah, and it's one of these things that I think we need to be. I think that sense of curiosity, where the world that we experience on the daily online, is not one that's shared with everybody on the globe. As part of that conversation in the book about the interplanetary file system, I also talk about the El Paquete in Cuba. That the El Paquete Semanal is this weekly package that's shared in Cuba because of the similar constraints around having enough bandwidth, censorship, and all the rest. And so what has happened in Cuba is that 1 terabyte USB drives get loaded up every week with movies and articles and ads, even local ads for, Cuban businesses and things. And really everything that you would expect from a week of internet activity is put onto a static thumb drive and passed around and shared for a reasonable amount of money. And that, again, experience of the web, though it's not necessarily the case now, but in the early, in the teens, maybe a decade ago, this was certainly much more common in Cuba. But as a model for data storage and data sharing, as a community model, there's a kind of resiliency there. And that kind of hacker ethos, right, if we can use the term, is taken up to solve a very real problem. And in the solving of the problem, there's a community that's created. There's an economy that grows up around it. And I think that that's the kind of, innovation and thinking that is coming from a place that is not at all the kind of web that we experience daily, but I think could have some real lessons if kind of translated into different contexts, like the one that we live in with, 24/7 ubiquitous web that's mobile and constantly in our pocket. So I'm looking to different structures, and as you said, a kind of philosophy that comes out of code almost, that can give us a different way to think about the web, because it's a pretty flexible space if we want it to be.
Yeah, at least I think that's what I did want it to be. I'll use myself when I first started building websites a long, long time ago. There were 3 major concepts I felt like in your book. I'd like to touch on them briefly because I think they capture something I'd like to see. The first one is privacy is increasingly the most valuable digital service, and a broad societal awareness of cybersecurity practices will be required to achieve economic stability and political sovereignty. I haven't really no one has captured that in such a clarifying way as to why privacy is valuable. My question about this statement is a little bit economic. Do you think that, especially the students that you're teaching, the future buyers and decision makers of economic decisions, are they weighing privacy more heavily than you or I did, Aaron, 15 years ago? Is this part of the buying decision?
Yeah, there is certainly a sense that my students, if I can speak to them for them as a group, for what it's worth, I don't want to kind of lump them together, but they are pretty savvy, I gotta say. Like they know what world they're in, but there's a sense of resignation that gives me some pause, I suppose, that it's really difficult to change the current market. It's a difficult space to kind of move beyond. And so, you do kind of situate yourself in a platform, right? You become part of Google, you become part of Microsoft or Apple. And these companies you kind of capitulate to in a way that just kind of makes your life easier, and it's a necessary evil. And in all of that, I think that privacy is one of those quantities or qualities that maybe we have lost a sense of what it's really worth. because we do give it up quite easily. And there's a sense that if, you argue for your privacy, what are you hiding? Or that you think that you're pretty important, that you need privacy when you're a 20-year-old kid. But those 20-year-olds, as you said, will, become the leaders of tomorrow. And I hope that they really do. And there will be a whole trail of digital footprints that are retained by companies on them. And I think that this is concerning to me in a pretty practical sense. In the book, again, I bring up a 2018 video from Google that was called The Selfish Ledger. I don't know if you remember this. And it was a futuristic, admittedly not a product video, but an imaginary kind of world set forth by Google, where they proposed a ledger on the self that all the data collected from your smartwatch and your phone and all of your browsing and purchasing behavior would be collected into not just a profile for an individual, but an intergenerational data set that charts every aspect of your life from birth, your health, your happiness, and productivity. And if that could be charted in the video, as they describe, across generations, that they might be able to solve really intractable problems like, depression, health issues, poverty. And it sounds great. But this is a dystopia where privacy has completely been removed from any sense of human experience. And it sounds, a little bit far-fetched, perhaps, and even in Google's own, discussion of it, it was never intended to be more than a thought piece. But we really do have a moment where the reality of someone's life has been captured from beginning to end. And it's not necessarily even being processed by humans. It's not necessarily even being held, but by these kind of non-human entities that are being now trained on this data, where we have companies that, and I go back to this author, Ed Finn, a book called What Algorithms Want. And he more or less describes these companies as really just like a stack of algorithms in a corporate trench coat. They really are, a system that is to facilitate the growth and maintenance of certain algorithms. And in Google's case, PageRank is just one of them now. And so why does this matter? Well, it really defines our relationship to the economy, where we maybe are no longer, part of a productive kind of exchange between, a reciprocal exchange with these companies, but instead are being farmed or mined for our data, and the return to society is less and less. And so this is the real concern for me here is that, with the loss of privacy, that it's a loss of our ability to have a kind of agency that is free from, kind of this interference.
One of the next concept that you present, and I think it is an attempt for us to ameliorate some of that power differential, is you say, programming is a fundamental literacy of the 21st century. The ability to make, manipulate, and circumvent data harvesting systems will be a critical skill. Certainly, knowing how to program as well as write effectively has been a critical skill in my career. But I think what you're proposing here, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that we're nearing the point where everyone needs to know how to code a little, because you're going to need to find a way to manipulate these systems to your benefit.
Yeah, I think the story that I told around Parlor tricks is a good example of that. Being in the right place at the right time with the right skill set will have historical consequences. And now I'm not saying that that everybody needs to be some kind of super hacker with a VR headset. That's kind of far-fetched, right? But there is that broad-based literacy that will be needed. And, I find, inspiration in the open source intelligence community, actually. Groups like Bellingcat, founded by Elliot Higgins. The open source intelligence community is not really doing a lot of programming, though they're developing software and things to support their teams. But these are also just very perceptive people who are using tools and accessing open information that's available, like Google Earth and things like this that are really there for checking things. And so like Bellingcat, spend a lot of time investigating war crimes in Syria. They've really well reported issues in Russia with Alexei Navalny and, the Novichok poisoning incidences. And so these are moments where, we've had moments of historical consequence that are being recorded again by people who are simply paying attention. And that even in all of this, that coding absolutely is a key piece of it, but that it's also in an age of disinformation. They remind us that, facts are surprisingly abundant and they're easy to come by. And so that kind of gives me a lot of hope for the kind of literacy that we're talking about. And, young people know how to go deep on social media and that's a real skill. And I think that that's a good one. But, even open source intelligence and its kind of explosion on Twitter, pardon me, X, I guess, that it's one of these things that is also being co-opted because it has that illusion of truthiness. And so Bellingcat's been even doing a lot of work to kind of debunk and warning that a lot of these open source intelligence accounts are really not doing good citizen journalism. They're kind of not citing the original source. They're not archiving it. They lack context. They're editing the footage and manipulating it, posting before verifying. So a lot of these standards are not being really accounted for. And so, it's another example why we can't have nice things that, as soon as we have one process that's, or methodology that is taken up to do some good, it tends to get co-opted by bad actors. But again, it's about having that awareness of that overall ecosystem and not looking at things, at face value. So having a critical sensibility really matters.
Third element is speculative fiction has long been used to express ethical questions and imagine possible futures. And I think one of the themes that is very hope-giving in your book is about how humans are an element of change when it seems like we can't, and we tell stories to help us see what that change would be. So my question for you, Aaron, is, are there any authors or fiction books that you're reading that are futures that you maybe look forward to or feel like have some vision of what we may want to be? Yeah.
Well, the book recommendation. I could go on. I actually picked up the other day the Big Book of Cyberpunk, edited by Jared Shurin. I'm holding it in my hand right now. And it's a collection, so it has things from a lot of periods of time, but it doesn't have a lot of repeats. And so I find it a really nice collection. And the one that I'm actually ended on before coming on with you now is a short story from 2014 called Patterns of Murmuration in a Billion Points of Data by Neon Yang. And this short story is really evocative to me in the era of large language models and this chat interface with AI. And the story, not to give too much away, is about this I that is this distributed intelligence. It uses the first person plural we when it describes itself. And its mother is dead. And so it's seeking answers as to the destruction of its creator. And we get these little windows into the human operator as they chat back and forth. And we see this artificial intelligence kind of moving through the web and, being a bit of a citizen journalist in its own way. And so this is a pretty evocative story, and it anticipates a lot of the things that I think we're looking at now. Maybe there's things happening in these systems that we can't anticipate. Of course, it's science fiction and it's fun, but that's definitely one to pick up. I found it pretty shocking.
That's excellent. Aaron, before we wrap up here, we know you have a new book coming out very soon, The Language of Cyberattacks. Just give us when could we look forward to that book being released, and anything you'd like to say about the meaning of the book or the content? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, no, I love this question. So the book's available September 5th, 2024 on bloomsbury.com. It's about 25 or $30, depending on your currency. And in it, I describe security rhetoric as a way to test malicious messages in spam and social media and social engineering attacks. And it really is a follow-on hacking in humanities. And I, use it as an opportunity to really take issue with some of the, pop psychology that's been used to support some of the writing on social engineering up till now. I describe how, a look at the language of a cyber attack, the lures that are used, can be pretty influential in the attribution of a cyber attack. And I also, in the final chapter, I study the Conti Leaks affair, which was the moment where we got that big dump from one of the most terrible ransomware crews operating at the time. They were attacking hospitals during the pandemic and devoted themselves to Vladimir Putin at the opening of the invasion of the war in Ukraine. But a Ukrainian national in Kyiv was able to gain a foothold in their infrastructure and dumped all of their software and chat logs for many years. And it was a moment to really see how the attackers were operating, see their techniques and processes. But in it, I think it really also made an argument for, a more kind of cybersecurity, where I'm really thinking about moving away from the war metaphor, away from attackers and defenders, and starting to see that, a lot of the low-level operators in Conti that we were able to see in the chat logs were not much better off. They were pretty hard pressed and were, they were criminals and kids, but they were also victims of a pretty large system. And so I think it was a window into, the kind of cybercrime that I think gives us a sense that it's not merely attackers and defenders, that there's a lot of forces at work. So that was, I think, a pretty important move that let me kind of describe a broader sense around what's happening online when we think about the beginning of a cyber attack and how that occurs with a lure. It's coming out soon, and I think it's one to look out for.
I'm very excited to read it. I thoroughly enjoyed Hacking the Humanities. Thanks for being a great guest on the podcast today, Aaron. We appreciate you joining us.
Thanks very much, Justin. It was a lot of fun.